So welcome to our fourth session on the call of the Divine Beloved. We are in the middle of the seven valleys at this point. And we last week looked at the valley of love, and this week we're passing into the valley of knowledge. And immediately one might ask, not reading or not being aware of the underlying terminology of the seven valleys, what makes knowledge a higher thing than love? Isn't love greater than knowledge? And the word for knowledge here used in the seven valleys is not the word for knowledge that we typically think of as the kind of learning that one receives through teachers or in books, the knowledge of the world. The word for knowledge here in the realm of knowledge is ma'rifat, which is, for our purposes, the same as erfan. It's based on the same root in Arabic. And it's the case in general in the Baha'i writings that there are often two ways of thinking about and speaking of knowledge. And both Persian and Arabic are fortunate in that they have two different distinct words, ilm and erfan, to describe these two different modes of knowledge. And in English, we just have the one word, knowledge. However, ma'rifat, which is translated here as knowledge, also has perhaps closer in English the sense of intuition. But the idea and the subject of knowledge in the Baha'i writings is, I suspect, when you read through the Baha'i writings, you find very oftentimes you find statements such as there are two kinds of knowledge. And I found several dozen of these. And one gets the sense in looking at how knowledge is sometimes described of in different modes that there aren't just two ways of thinking about knowledge, that it's almost like a pile of sand, and you can take a knife and cut a pile of sand any number of ways you want. And although it may not be quite to that degree with the idea of knowledge in the Baha'i writings, I'll just give you a few examples from the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. And this might give you a sense of how knowledge can be thought of in different modes. So in Some Answer Questions, Abdu'l-Baha says, know that the power and the comprehension of the human spirit are of two kinds. That is to say, they perceive and act in two different modes. One way is through instruments and organs. The other manifestation of the powers and actions of the spirit is without instruments and organs. Baha'u'llah in the book of Certitude says, know verily that knowledge is of two kinds, divine and satanic. The one welleth out from the fountain of divine inspiration, the other is but a reflection of vain and obscure thoughts. If you want to divide up knowledge, do they line up in the same way? Maybe not necessarily. Abdu'l-Baha in another place says, knowledge is of two kinds, conceptual and positive, or to use another expression, acquired and innate. For example, we know that water exists, but this is purely conceptual knowledge. When we have drunk it, it becomes positive knowledge. That is why it is said that complete knowledge of a thing is positive and not conceptual. And in still another place, Abdu'l-Baha says, there are two considerations concerning knowledge. The first is its essence and reality, and the second is its action. And finally, also in Some Answer Questions, Abdu'l-Baha says, know that there are two kinds of knowledge, the knowledge of the essence of a thing and the knowledge of its qualities. So this is just to give you a sense that there is, I think, a bit of depth and complexity to the idea of knowledge and the different kinds of knowledge. And it begs the question, what kind of knowledge is Baha'u'llah referring to in the Valley of Knowledge? And I think, judging from how he describes the Valley of Knowledge and what the principal themes of the Valley of Knowledge are, we might guess it has something to do with distinguishing between the usual kind of knowledge, which isn't even one of the valleys, which is the knowledge of what we might call sight, versus the knowledge here described, which is more like insight. There's the usual kind of book knowledge or ilm, which is perhaps such a lower form of knowledge that it's not even, it doesn't even rank, a rung in the spiritual ladder. But the realm of knowledge here that comes after love is part of the realm of insight. And it's the difference between sight and insight, between these two kinds of knowledge, is the difference between the ilm kind of knowledge, the knowledge that divides, that discriminates, that analyzes and takes apart, the knowledge that looks at the forest and sees the trees. And that kind of knowledge is contrasted with the knowledge that Baha'u'llah is speaking of here, which is the knowledge that unifies, that synthesizes, that puts things together, that reconciles opposites, and that looks at the trees and sees the forest. I think one might be tempted to say, well, one of these, ilm, is what we might call scientific knowledge, and the other is revealed knowledge. But I suspect that the comparison is facile, because scientific knowledge also, while it analyzes and divides, there's also a mode of scientific intuition that unifies. So to think of of knowledge necessarily as divided along those lines might not capture the totality of it. So let's turn to what Baha'u'llah says in the Valley of Knowledge, and comment on a few of the further terms that exist here. So, and if, this is paragraph 23, and if confirmed by the Creator, the lover escapeth the claws of the eagle of love, he will enter the realm of knowledge and come out of doubt into certitude, and turn from the darkness of wayward desire to the guiding light of the fear of God. His inner eye will open, and he will privily converse with his beloved. He will unlock the gates of truth and supplication, and shut the doors of idle fancy. He in this realm is content with the divine decree, and seeth war as peace, and in death findeth the meaning of everlasting life. With both inward and outward eyes he witnesseth the mysteries of resurrection in the realms of creation and in the souls of men, and with a spiritual heart apprehendeth the wisdom of God in his endless manifestations. In the sea he findeth a drop, in a drop he beholdeth the secrets of the sea. Split the atom's heart, and lo, within it thou wilt find a sun. So there's a lot of points that can be made on this paragraph. The first is the paragraph sounds, I think, a lot like that portion of the Book of Certitude on the requirements and path of the true seeker, which we read a part of last week, which describes the prerequisites of the seeker progressing from the state of search to that of enraptured love, and then entering the city of certitude. What Baha'u'llah is describing here sounds a lot like that city of certitude from the Book of Certitude. And this certitude that the seeker emerges into, the state of certitude that the seeker emerges into. I think also we might have mentioned last week or the week before that traditionally there are 3 degrees of certitude. There's the ilmul yaqeen, the ainul yaqeen, and the haqqul yaqeen, or the knowledge of certitude, the eye of certitude, and the truth of certitude. And the knowledge of certitude is more or less corresponds to this idea of ilm, or knowledge of book learning, the knowledge of being told about the fire, whereas the second degree of certitude, the ainul yaqeen, is the degree of certitude of that one receives, which is like seeing the flame with one's own eyes. And that ainul yaqeen, that idea of the eye of certitude, I think is likely the closest match to the certitude that Baha'u'llah is describing here, that one passes into, and which means that there's a higher degree still, which is the haqqul yaqeen, or the truth of certitude, which characterizes the later valleys. And turn from the darkness of wayward desire to the guiding light of the fear of God. And the word for fear of God here, taqwa, is a word which has many different translations in the Baha'i writings. Here it was translated as fear of God, but Shoghi Effendi elsewhere has translated this as righteousness, or even integrity or piety. So the idea is not just fear of God, but also the idea of righteousness and integrity. The first thing we start noticing in this paragraph, and we notice it more and more in the paragraphs to come, is that something that characterizes this valley, once the seeker has passed through the valley of love, which is characterized by this abandonment of reason, but also behind it there's a pain and there's a tension of opposites that remains in the valley of love. The lover is desiring of the beloved, and it's that polarity which really describes let's say the heart of the valley of love. Whereas in the next valley, in the valley of knowledge, there is a resolution of the tension. There's a coming to see a peace in war, to see the drop in the sea, the atom in the sun. One can actually look through this valley of knowledge and list all of the tensions, all of the opposites, which are resolved through the eye of and knowledge of the seeker in this valley. The opposites that I saw were war and peace, death and life. And here, death and life is fana and bara, which we've referred to before, and we'll talk about more in the future. The sea and the drop, the atom and the sun, justice and injustice, ignorance and knowledge, the end and the beginning, conciliation and enmity. So all of these hard opposites, the seeker in this valley is able to resolve them. But as we'll see, the resolution of these opposites, the resolution of the opposing pairs, which takes place in the realm of knowledge, is a resolution that still leaves the pairs separate from each other. Whereas, welcome, Velda. Whereas in the valley of love, you have the existence of. Please take a. Yeah. Whereas in the valley of love, you have the existence of the lover and the beloved, and the tension of the opposites. And in the valley of knowledge, you have the resolution of the tension. You have these various pairs which get resolved because the seeker in this valley can see the end in the beginning. But that's still a valley of limitation because the opposites remain. They've been resolved, but they're still seen as opposites. Which is why there's further valleys in which the opposites dissolve and one is no longer even seeing the opposites. So one can look at the progression of the stages of, at least of one of the main, let's say, themes in the progression of the eye of the seeker through the seven valleys is this theme of from love to knowledge to unity, which is this tension of opposites, resolution of opposites, and then even transcending opposing pairs entirely in the valleys that remain. Which is why Baha'u'llah, as much as he lauds and extols the state of the seeker in the realm of knowledge, and even says this is the state of certitude. This is, if you read the book of Certitude, you might think this is the end. This is the highest station one can hope for. Baha'u'llah ends by saying this is still one of the valleys of limitation. And it's a valley of limitation because even though you've reached certitude, and even though you've been able to see the end in the beginning and reach these great spiritual insights, you haven't reached the end of the journey because you're still seeing things as resolved into different things. You're still seeing with the eye of distinction as opposed to the eye of unity. Things are still separated in your mind. And the ultimate, where is Baha'u'llah going with this? Why is this so key to the message? That he will eventually be proclaiming with greater and greater clarity as the years go on. Part of, I think, what he's doing is preparing the seeker for the idea that there is one state in which one sees the manifestations of God, the prophets of God, as separate, and then there's another stage in which one sees them, a higher stage, let's say, in which one sees them ultimately as one and united, and in which one sees the end in the beginning, which is a bit of a prelude to one of the great, let's say, theological conundrums that Baha'u'llah has to resolve which he does in the book of Certitude, which is the conundrum of how is it that Muhammad in the Quran itself can have said something like Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, which universally has been taken by Muslims, whether Shiite or Sunni, as meaning that Muhammad is the final prophet. Muhammad is the end of prophecy. There's no prophecy. There might be some sort of eschatological ending afterwards. There might be some further let's say divine assistance from the divine realm in the latter days, but Muslims are not in general anticipating the appearance of another prophet. Baha'u'llah has to set the stage for that by explaining the idea of the end and the beginning. If you could talk about Muhammad as the last prophet, well, according to the seekers in the Valley of Knowledge, calling him the last prophet is the same as calling him the first prophet. So you take the idea of lastness and you make it interchangeable with firstness. So that's one of the let's say, some of the theological groundwork that has to be built out before one can introduce still another prophet and then answer the question, well, how is it that the prophet that came before was the last prophet? And the answer would be, well, every prophet is both first and last. Every prophet in their own way encompasses all the attributes that are possible to be encompassed by a prophet. So in this realm of knowledge, then, you have this resolution of opposites. And Baha'u'llah puts it, I think, more clearly in the next paragraph, paragraph 24, where he says, gazing with the eye of absolute insight, the wayfarer in this valley seeth in God's creation neither contradiction nor incongruity, and at every moment exclaimeth, no defect canst thou see in the creation of the God of mercy. Repeat the gaze, seest thou a single flaw. And this is one case also where the new translation helps bring clarity to a point which was lost in the old translation, which in place of neither contradiction or incongruity, it said something else. It said nothing save clear providence, which doesn't really bring out the idea that one of the key insights that reaches the seeker in the valley of knowledge is this resolution of contradiction, and it comes out more explicitly here. And at every moment exclaimeth, no defect canst thou see in the creation of the God of mercy. Repeat the gaze, seest thou a single flaw. And here we have an idea of the universe being characterized by perfection. And this is one of the examples, actually. Is the universe perfect? Is nature perfect, or is it imperfect? It's a perfect example of one of the pairs of tensions, one of the pairs of things which on the face of it seem to be even contradicting each other, which through the eye of ma'rifat, through the eye of knowledge in this valley, one is able to find a way through. On this topic of perfection and the perfection of creation, there are a number of statements in the Baha'i writings, and Baha'u'llah, beginning with Baha'u'llah, who actually quotes one of the very first philosophers, as Baha'u'llah says, that we have any record of, although to the academic world, the very existence of this person is a bit lost in the mists of legend. And I'm referring here to Hermes, and Baha'u'llah refers to Hermes as the first philosopher in one of his tablets. And he also quotes from Hermes in another one of his tablets, saying that it is impossible for the realm of creation to be better than it already is. And Abdu'l-Baha underlines this point in one of his tablets, where he says, look into this endless universe. A universal power inevitably existeth, which encompasseth all, directing and regulating all the parts of this infinite creation. And were it not for this director, this coordinator, the universe would be flawed and deficient. It would be even as a madman, whereas ye can see that this endless creation carrieth out its functions in perfect order, every separate part of it performing its own task with complete reliability, nor is there any flaw to be found in all its workings. Thus it is clear that a universal power existeth, directing and regulating this infinite universe. So Abdu'l-Baha's statement of the perfection of the universe is connected to the existence of the immutable laws of nature, the fact that everything happens in a regular way, that there's no arbitrariness. Imperfection then it can be interpreted as a sort of a relative deficiency, and the imperfection of things is always, if the universe is described of as being imperfect, it's not contradicting this earlier statement that there's nothing in creation better than that which already is, but one is describing relative deficiencies. When one talks about the imperfection of things, it's always with reference to a higher degree. So, for example, in one of his talks, Abdu'l-Baha says, nature is the material world. When we look upon it, we see that it is dark and imperfect. It sounds like a flat-out contradiction from what was said before. But if you read on, he says, for instance, if we allow a piece of land to remain in its natural condition, we will find it covered with thorns and thistles, useless weeds, and wild vegetation will flourish upon it, and it will become like a jungle. This is the incompleteness and imperfection of the world of nature. And what makes weeds and thorns imperfect? Well, they're not imperfect in their own sphere. In their own sphere, everything is perfect. But in relation to the sphere of human cultivation and habitation, you want to have land that is productive of fruits and is contributing to civilization. And so when we talk about imperfections of things, it's in relation to higher degrees of perfection. The point of bringing this out is to give one example of this pair of tension, of opposites, a tension which can be resolved if one sees through, let's say, through the eye of knowledge. And just to reel back to the end of paragraph 24, because this is also how Abdu'l-Baha resolves this tension of opposites very beautifully. When we look at Baha'u'llah describing the secrets, the drop containing the secrets of the sea, and splitting the atom's heart and seeing within it a sun, Abdu'l-Baha in his Tablet of the Universe takes these images and gives an extended, beautiful description of the interrelatedness of opposites, which is a feature of the universe. And he says it in the following terms. And this interrelatedness of opposites extends to things that we think of as traditionally as fundamentally opposite, material and spiritual. Abdu'l-Baha says these are all woven together in a way that resolves the tension. He says, these are heavenly truths pertaining to the spiritual world. Infer then from these truths that which pertaineth to the physical world. For physical things are signs and imprints of spiritual things. Every lower reality is an image and pattern of a higher one. Nay, inferior and superior, material and spiritual, accidental and essential, particular and universal, foundation and structure, form and meaning, and the outward and inward realities of all things. All of these are connected one with another and are interrelated in such wise that ye find drops to be patterned after seas and atoms to be fashioned after suns, in accordance with their capacities and potentialities. For particulars, in relation to that which is below them, are universals, while what are great universals in the eyes of those that are veiled are in fact particulars in relation to higher beings and realities. Universal and particular are in reality incidental and relative considerations. So Abdu'l-Baha takes some of the most, let's say, concepts that have the greatest history behind them of having been described, very clearly and obviously as two different things. And he said these are actually, universal and particular, material and spiritual. And says these are actually relative realities, depending on, let's say, depending on the lens you're looking through. One can see them either as separate, or one can see them as ultimately, let's say, two sides of one coin. And that is the essence of the distinction between the first three valleys and the valleys that follow it. The valleys of limitation, up to and including the valley of knowledge, and the valleys that follow. And Baha'u'llah then moves on, and this is after paragraph 24. He gives the long story relating the story of the lover and the watchman, and the overall theme of which, I guess I'll read it, and then we can talk about some of the ideas in it. He says there were, and this is one of those stories that I think, despite efforts to find a precedent in earlier literature, because it's, one might suspect that Baha'u'llah is recasting an earlier story, maybe in Conference of the Birds or elsewhere. And although the Conference of the Birds in the Valley of Knowledge does have a story of a watchman, it's nothing like this. So it's, as far as we can tell, a pure creation of Baha'u'llah's. He says, there once was a lover, it is said, who had sighed for long years in separation from his beloved, and wasted in the fire of remoteness. From the rule of love, his breast was void of patience, and his body weary of his spirit. He reckoned life without her as a mockery, and the world consumed him away. How many a day he found no respite from his longing, how many a night the pain of her kept him from sleep. His body was worn to a sigh, and his heart's wound had turned him to a cry of sorrow. 1,000 lives would he freely have given for one taste of the cup of her presence, yet even this was not within his reach. The doctors knew no cure for him, and companions avoided his company. Yea, physicians have no remedy for one sick of love, unless the favor of the beloved deliver him. At last the tree of his longing yielded the fruit of despair, and the fire of his hope fell to ashes. Then one night he could bear life no more, and he left his house for the marketplace. Of a sudden, a watchman followed after him. He broke into a run with a watchman in swift pursuit. Then other watchmen came together and barred every passage to the weary one. And that wretched one cried from his heart and ran here and there and moaned to himself, surely this watchman is Israel, my angel of death, following so fast upon me. Or he is a tyrant of men prompted by hatred and malice. His feet carried him on, that hapless one, bleeding with the arrow of love, while his heart lamented. Then he came to a garden wall, and with untold pain and trouble he scaled it. He saw that it was very high, yet, forgetting his life, he threw himself down into the garden. And there he beheld his beloved, with a lamp in her hand, searching for a ring she had lost. When the heart-surrendered lover looked upon his ravishing love, he drew a great breath and lifted his hands in prayer, crying, O God, bestow honor upon the watchman, and riches and long life. For the watchman was Gabriel guiding this poor one, or he was Israfil bringing life to this wretched one. Indeed, his words were true, for he had found many a secret justice in this seeming tyranny of the watchman, and had seen how many a mercy lay hid behind the veil. In one stroke of wrath, the guard had joined one who was athirst in the desert of love to the sea of the beloved, and dispelled the darkness of separation with the shining light of reunion. He had led one who was afar to the garden of nearness, and guided an ailing soul to the heart's physician. Now, if the lover could have seen the end, he would from the beginning have blessed the watchman, prayed God on his behalf, and seen his tyranny as justice. But since the end was veiled to him, he lamented and made his plaint in the beginning. Yet those who journey in the garden land of true knowledge, since they see the end in the beginning, behold peace in war and conciliation in enmity. So one way of reading the story of the lover and the watchman is that it's ultimately an allegory on the wisdom of suffering and the limits of love. And the watchman represents all of the sufferings and indignities that we endure in life. And the lover in the valley of love can't see the end in the beginning, and so they lament and they weep, and it's all a great difficulty to them. But once they scale the wall, and the wall is that barrier that separates the valley of love from the valley of knowledge, and it's a high wall. It's difficult to pass from the valley of love into the valley of knowledge. But once one passes into that valley of knowledge, one sees the end in the beginning. One realizes that all of the sufferings that one has endured in life have an ultimate point, that there is a way to reconcile war and peace and hatred and love and all of these opposites and tensions and sufferings of life, and see them in a broader context. There's one or two more points in here, and I have no idea what the ring she had lost was. It's kind of one often wonders, what does that symbolize? If anyone has any ideas, feel free to toss them into the ring. But
wasn't that a ring that he had given her in Romeo and Juliet? I think that's the story of the ring.
Yeah.
Is that he had given her a ring, and that's all she had of him.
Isn't that Juliet represents the Almighty, the divine?
In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet.
Or Lady Majnun.
Yeah. So could this be Layli and Majnun? Yeah.
It is God's wish that he may, believe in him.
Yeah. I don't know.
Story is Majnun still right? The watchman was running away but he still ran.
Yes.
He didn't give up to the watchman.
Mm-hmm.
He ran and scaled the wall.
Yeah. Made it to the other side.
Well, in that one phrase, he scaled the wall and forgetting his life.
Mm-hmm.
Forgetting his
life.
Yes.
He
Scales it.
I was thinking of that.
Yeah. And that's a great theme also late in the wall, once one scales the later walls into the other valleys, this forgetting of one's life and death of the self becomes one of the preeminent ideas.
Stephen, is
Yeah.
he'd known the end in the beginning, would he have thrown his life? Would he have thrown himself into the garden? Because there would be the sense of being driven or desperation would not have been present.
Yeah.
So perhaps he would have reflected, calculated, how can I do this more smoothly or less risk? And so I have stopped him.
That raises the great question of why don't we all just start out in the valley of knowledge? If there's some, if there's a cosmic purpose to human life, and that cosmic purpose has to do with reaching a certain endpoint, then why aren't we just created in that endpoint? What's the purpose of being created at so far away from that endpoint? Yeah, there's some point to the journey, and maybe one way of looking at the point is the journey, not the end of the journey. This and maybe this is also two ways of looking at the same coin. Whether one looks at the purpose of life as reaching a certain goal, or whether one looks at the purpose as as attaining the goal and striving for the goal itself. It ends up being two ways of looking at the same thing.
If the journey wasn't the point.
Yeah.
It had been written as
Of course, yeah. There's obviously a point to the journey.
There's also the fact that knowledge as ilm
Mm-hmm.
is really in the domain of the mind,
Mm-hmm.
operates in the domain of the mind, whereas love operates in the domain of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for knowledge as ilm to become that certitude, the knowledge has to travel through the domain of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
So there needs to be a connection that's made.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why you got to go through the valley of love, so that your ability to love is triggered. It
Mm-hmm.
has to wake up.
Mm-hmm.
Once your ability to love is awakened, then knowledge can begin to operate through that channel.
It's almost like and this is also true in human love, that the act of falling in love is destructive in a way. It breaks a shell. It breaks down the boundaries of the ego in ways that otherwise there's really no other power that can do that. And only when those ego boundaries are broken can other kinds of forces and influences have their effect. But it's that pain and travail of love which has very much the point. It's almost like it's the seed, and the pain it sort of breaks that outer casing of the seed, which has to happen for the seedling to grow.
Is that our limitations pretty much, the human being's limitation is that we will never be able to see the end in the beginning. We don't know what the outcome is, but we do know that we need to be hopeful that there is a light at the end of it, and there's reason for everything that happens.
Yeah.
Right?
Even the seeing the end in the beginning that Baha'u'llah promises in this valley of knowledge, which is again only the third valley of the seven, is not an all-seeing kind of thing. I mean, all sorts of things remain veiled to the seeker, even at the end of the journey. I mean, even the prophets write about their inability to grasp the totality of things, and so I think it's absolutely true that however and wherever one is in one's spiritual journey, one has to deal at some point fundamentally with one's weakness and lack of knowledge. The Baha'u'llah goes on, and I think paragraph 30 for me is really a pivotal paragraph in terms of clarifying what the point of the seven valleys is and the overall structure of the valleys, because he's just described this state of the lover in the valley of knowledge, but as a way of giving an allegorical story to point out the fundamental limitation of the standpoint of love, and how in the standpoint of knowledge, one sees the end in the beginning, one sees the watchman, which represents, let's say, suffering, and one is able to accept it with a certain kind of equanimity because one sees the end result of that suffering. Which is ultimately spiritual growth. But even that idea of seeing the end of the beginning ends up being a limited state, because he goes on in paragraph 30 to say, such is the state of the wayfarers in this valley. But the people of the valleys above this see the end and the beginning as one. And then he keeps one-upping it. He says, nay, they see neither beginning nor end, and witness neither first nor last. Nay, rather, the denizens of the city of immortality, this is Baga, who dwell in the celestial garden, see not even neither first nor last. They fly from all that is first and repulse all that is last. For these have passed over the worlds of names, and swift as lightning fled beyond the worlds of attributes. Thus it is said, the perfection of belief in divine unity is to deny him any attributes. And they have made their dwelling place in the shadow of the divine essence. So Baha'u'llah is giving us a prelude of the valleys to come. And in the next valley, and there's at least two very distinct stages to come after the valley of knowledge. So after one reaches the point of seeing the end of the beginning, but still one is seeing the individual trees in the forest, let's say, there comes a stage after that in which one no longer sees the individual trees in the forest. One now sees the totality of things. That's the standpoint that one is looking from. But still, that valley of unity in which one has resolved, not just resolved the oppositions, but has now unified them. There's still a stage above that, and the stage above that is a stage in which one is no longer even in the realm of attributes, because the limitation of the realm of unity is that one is still, let's say, trapped in the realm of attributes, and the next highest realm above that is the realm in which, let's say, and this becomes even more clear in some of the tablets that follow that we'll be looking at in future weeks, as well as in Gems of Divine Mysteries, that there are future valleys which almost subvert the whole idea of valleys. You know, there reaches a valley where one leaves aside the concept of valleys, and there reaches a valley where one is no longer even connected to, one is no longer contemplating the attributes of God, because ultimately all the attributes of God, all the attributes, what we associate with reality, ultimately are at a lower level. You know, reality itself excludes, fundamentally excludes any attributes that we can imagine. So what this ends up doing is it ends up giving us a kind of pivot point that we can understand the seven valleys, you know, pivoting around. And that pivot point is that, let's say, the wall between the third valley and the fourth valley. That is the first three valleys of search and love and knowledge being fundamentally valleys of distinction and limitation. And then the pivot point is the passage into the valleys of unity, which come afterwards. And that's a major point, I think, where if there was any reason to issue a corrected translation of the seven valleys, that would be one of the main things one would want to do is where Baha'u'llah introduces the valley of unity. He says it's the first station of unity instead of the valley of unity, implying that really all the valleys that follow, the four valleys that follow, are all valleys of unity in a sense, which also further underlines this idea of there being essentially a distinction between the first three valleys as valleys of distinction and the next four as valleys of unity. So Baha'u'llah goes on, wherefore Khaja Abdullah, may God the Most High sanctify his blessed soul, hath made in this connection a subtle point and spoken an eloquent word as to the meaning of guide thou us on the straight path, which is show us the right way, that is, honor us with the love of thine essence, that we may be freed from occupation with ourselves and aught else save thee, and become wholly thine, that we may know only thee and see only thee and think of none save thee. And this is referring to a commentary on the opening verses of the Quran, this guide thou us on the straight path, which in Arabic it's ihdina ila siratul mustaqim. The whole opening surah of the Quran is quite beautiful. It's Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa Iyyaka nasta'een, Ihdina ila siratul mustaqim, sirata alladhi an'amta alayhim, la maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. So this guide thou us on the straight path, it comes from that opening surah, which is in the name of God the Compassionate, the Merciful, praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. Guide us onto the straight path, the path of those whom thou hast guided, not those upon whom thy wrath is fallen, something like that. So nay, they would even soar above this station, as it is said, love is a veil betwixt the lover and beloved. More than this I am not permitted to tell. Baha'u'llah requotes this in the Four Valleys. It's an important enough point that love is a veil. And I think in light of what we've discussed, we can understand how it is a veil, because ultimately the lover and the beloved are one. And as long as one is in the state of conceiving of the beloved as other than the lover, there's still a veil between them. At this hour, and this is one of the interesting places where maybe Baha'u'llah is making a bit of a veiled declaration as to his own station. He says, at this hour the morn of true knowledge hath dawned, and the lamps of wayfaring and wandering have been quenched. Veiled from this was Moses too, despite his virtue and his light. Then thou, who hast no wings at all, abandon any hope of flight. So it's as though he's telling his interlocutor, you've reached the end of the journey now, and even Moses couldn't go further. So this is it's a bit of maybe a veiled suggestion that he's face to face with the sort of as far as he's going to get in his encounter with the truth, in his interaction with Baha'u'llah. If thou be a man of communion and prayer, soar upon the wings of assistance from the holy ones, that thou mayest behold the mysteries of the friend and attain the lights of the beloved. Verily we are God's, and to him shall we return. And then finally, after passing through the valley of knowledge, which is the last station of limitation, the wayfarer cometh to the first station of unity. And we'll be continuing into the valley of unity next week. But to go further on this point of the resolution of opposites, that is really the keynote, let's say, of the valley of knowledge. There are great images that we find in really in the letters of Shoghi Effendi about this coming to a point of resolving contradictions. And most of these letters come from the mid-1940s, and there are 5 of them that I found where people have written to The Guardian complaining about issues they see or contradictions they see, internal contradictions that they see. Clearly people who are still in the Valley of Love but have not yet scaled the wall to land in the Valley of Knowledge. And these letters written on Shoghi Effendi's behalf give this great idea of the wholeness and totality of things, within which you might find things that in isolation might seem to be opposing each other, but if you look at it from a larger perspective, you see the underlying unity. So here's one of them. The evidence of the divine greatness of the cause is that its teachings are so perfectly balanced. No virtue is so overemphasized as to become a bias or weakness. It enables men to follow the golden mean, to be moderate and well-balanced in all their affairs. That is why one can find statements that, if taken by themselves, seem to be almost incompatible with each other. But taken as a whole, they form one perfect design, a pliable, workable system by which all men can live. And elsewhere, we must take the teachings as a great balanced whole, not seek out and oppose to each other 2 strong statements that have different meanings. Somewhere in between, there are links uniting the 2. That is what makes our faith so flexible and well-balanced. And the third quotation, these various statements must be taken in conjunction with all the Baha'i teachings. We cannot get a correct picture by concentrating on just one phrase. And the fourth quotation, he feels that many of the perplexities that arise in your mind could be dissipated if you always conceived of the teachings as one great whole with many facets. Truth may, in covering different subjects, appear to be contradictory, yet it is all one if you carry the thought through to the end. And finally, one might liken Baha'u'llah's teachings to a sphere. There are points, poles apart, and in between the thoughts and doctrines that unite them. That's my favorite one because it gives you this image of meridian line, not meridian line, yeah, meridian lines, I suppose, that connect the poles. And the imagery of the sphere is particularly powerful because it's the same thing with how we see a sphere. One can only see one hemisphere at a time. You can't see the entire sphere all at once. And that's the same thing with these sorts of ideas. It's as though one can look through a particular lens and then a certain hemisphere comes into focus. But when one hemisphere comes into focus, the opposite hemisphere necessarily disappears from view. And then you can then rotate the sphere and look at the other hemisphere, and that one comes into focus. But then you lose the first hemisphere. It's almost quantum mechanical. You can measure the position or the velocity of a fundamental particle with great precision, but not both at the same time. The more you focus on measuring the position of something, the more the velocity becomes unknown. I suppose you could say a deep, it's a reality of the deep structure of things, which is true equally in the physical domain as it is in the spiritual domain. And this idea of knowledge being fundamentally limited by this ability, let's say it's 2-dimensional. Reality is 3-dimensional, but our knowledge of things, and not just the ilm knowledge, but the ma'rifat knowledge, and any knowledge that we have of things is limited by fundamental human limitations. We can't see the 3-dimensionality of things. We can maybe intuit its existence, but we can't actually grasp it all in all of its features. And this point is made particularly clear by Abdu'l-Baha in the commentary on the Hidden Treasure that we talked about last week. We recall that there's this very famous hadith that Baha'u'llah quotes in his Kitab-i-Aqdas that goes, I was a hidden treasure. It speaks with the voice of God. It says, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. Therefore, I brought creation into being that I might become known. And Abdu'l-Baha breaks it up into 4 parts. The hidden treasure, which is God, loving to be known, with the theme of love. Therefore, I brought creation to being. So there's a 3rd section on creation. And the 4th section, that I might become known, Abdu'l-Baha has a whole section on knowledge. And the knowledge in this commentary of Abdu'l-Baha is the knowledge of ma'rifat. It's the knowledge of, it's the intuition knowledge, the same knowledge in the valley of knowledge, exactly the same word. And Abdu'l-Baha talks about this knowledge as being fundamentally limited. So it's not just the book learning that has these fundamental limitations. And this is how Abdu'l-Baha describes it in this wonderful commentary. He says, "The Lord of the first and the last hath in this connection considered the admission of powerlessness and poverty to be the summit of knowledge and the apex of wisdom, and hath reckoned this ignorance as the essence of knowledge. Thus he saith, we have not known thee as thou shouldst be known, and likewise increase my wonder and amazement at thee, O Lord." It may be that Abdu'l-Baha was referring to this tablet by Abdu'l-Baha. And this is in Gleanings, where Baha'u'llah says, "This confession of helplessness, which mature contemplation must eventually impel every mind to make, is in itself the acme of human understanding, and marketh the culmination of man's development." The highest point of understanding is a kind of throwing up one's hands and saying, "I don't get it." And he explains why that is. He goes even deeper in and sort of peels off more layers. He says, well, why is it that we can't understand? And because he goes on to explain how it is that we understand things. He says, all that can be attained in this station is utter bewilderment and absolute perplexity. For there are two requisites for one thing to understand another. The first is encompassing. That is, not until one thing encompasseth another can it apprehend the latter's inner nature. And it is evident that none hath so encompassed the divine essence as to apprehend its true nature, or to breathe a single fragrance from the bowers of the knowledge of its reality. Knowledge and understanding, indeed, cannot be realized without encompassing. The second is resemblance and similarity. Not unless an object resembleth another can it imagine the latter's reality. For bereft of its degrees and stages, how can the former conceive or imagine the latter? So how is it that, in light of this, how is it that, say, we can understand so much about the laws of the universe? In a way, because we're so much smaller than the cosmos. But there's this statement by Rumi that Baha'u'llah quotes, "Dost thou consider thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded?" So in a way, the human reality, as small as it is physically, in its ability to understand things, actually encompasses the whole universe. The microcosm contains within it the macrocosm. This is one of the most ancient ideas from philosophical thought. And it's that ability to contain the macrocosm which gives us the ability to understand so much about the physical world around us. But the spiritual realities, the higher realities, are not part of the macrocosm. They are beyond the macrocosm, and our hearts don't have the ability to encompass it. Our minds don't have the ability to encompass it. Maybe our hearts have the ability to reflect it. And so there's a difference between being able to surround something metaphorically and thus understand it, and being able to reflect its reality. And one can think of the mode of the knowledge of the divine more in the mode of reflection. The mirror reflects the sun. The sun is much greater than the mirror. You talk about the image of the sun being contained in the mirror, but really the reality of the sun is so vastly beyond that of the mirror. The most it can do is reflect, to a greater or lesser degree, the attributes of the mirror. That's one way of thinking about the difference between this grasping, encompassing power of the mind and the more reflective power of the heart. But Abdu'l-Baha's point ultimately is that, according to these two prerequisites of knowledge, the attainment of knowledge of ultimate reality is impossible, because we neither encompass nor resemble ultimate reality. And he goes on to state that where the furthermost limit of our knowledge therefore lies. He says, that which is intended by knowledge in this noble tradition hath therefore never been the knowledge of the inner essence of God, for this lieth beyond the realm of the possible. Rather, it is the knowledge of the signs and effulgences of that hidden, sanctified, and exalted being. For howsoever far unfettered minds and unsullied souls may advance in the realms of the knowledge of that sovereign Lord, they will apprehend not save the manifestations of that sign, deposited within the reality of man, that lead unto him. And howsoever high they may soar upon the wings of spiritual attainment in the limitless expanse of knowledge and vision, they will read not save the letters of the book of their own selves. For example, consider the circle. However a compass may move, it can only revolve around that point that marketh the center of the circle. And that supernal sign that hath been revealed in the reality of heavenly souls is exactly like unto that point, for all the senses and faculties of man revolve round it. I'm sure reminds us of the hidden word, turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting. So the highest form of knowledge then is that knowledge of the divine light shining within the soul, which is ultimately a reflection of the higher of a higher reality. It's the attributes and traces, let's say the shadow of that higher reality, but not the reality itself. And ultimately, that light shining within, that divine spark, is most fully visible in the realities of the manifestations of God. And Abdu'l-Baha goes on to say, in sum, that which is intended by knowledge in this holy tradition is the recognition of God's manifestation through these day springs of divine holiness, that is, his prophets and chosen ones. For otherwise the true nature of his essence hath never been, nor will ever be, knowable to any soul. So that's Abdu'l-Baha on the ultimate limits of knowledge. As far as the inner horizons of the human reality can encompass the physical world, the sort of the boundary of its ability to understand ends at the limit of the physical, and that's also, I think, points to the idea of the valley of knowledge fundamentally as being a valley of limitation. You know, even this knowledge of Erfan versus the knowledge of Ilm. So that's it on knowledge, and starting next week we'll move into the Valley of Unity, where things really get interesting, because it's almost as though this leaving the Valley of Knowledge and crossing this threshold into the Valley of Unity is one of the it's one of the most significant transitions. It represents the transition ultimately from a dualistic point of view to a monistic point of view. It's a transition from seeing, the world as resolved into different things, which is our very natural way of looking at the world, into entering into a different kind of a realm in which to see differences is itself a kind of a shortcoming. It also marks the dividing line between what has been called positive theology and negative theology. The theology of talking about the divine in terms of a being possessed of certain attributes, and the negative theology of where one talks about ultimate reality in terms of what it is not. It's the la before the illa in terms of the Arabic phrase, la ilaha illallah. There is no God but God, and the Sufi mystics have taken this idea, and we talked about this in our discussion of the Rashi Amma, that one begins with the la, one begins with the saying what it is not before we can get to what it is, and that's what these later valleys ultimately lead to, is more along the direction of negative theology. And this is another way in which the seven valleys represent a way of uniting East and West. We talked last week about the seven valleys as a prelude to a fundamental change in the structure of society. And one of the ways I think it does that is it gives us a kind of a mapping of spiritual realities in a way that bridges the theologies of the East and the theologies of the West. Because the theologies of the West in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition are very much wrapped around let's say, the first three valleys, wrapped around thinking about God in terms of what it is, about attributes of God, about laws and prophets and so forth. Whereas let's say the theological systems of the West, to perhaps unfairly boil things down, are less concerned with the thises and the that's, and are more concerned with the underlying unity behind things, the ultimate apprehension of the one consciousness that underlies all human consciousness. And that ultimately is a more monistic way of thinking. And Baha'u'llah's Seven Valleys embraces both of these modes of theological thought. And in that way, they help form a bridge between the East and the West. Because you're not ultimately saying one is wrong and the other is right. You're saying different seekers are in different stages. And it becomes even more clear when, say, we look at the four valleys, that we're not even talking about a progression where one is a lower valley than the other. But another way of looking at this whole topic is there are different kinds of, let's say, spiritual personalities which may very naturally look at the world through the eye of love, or through the eye of knowledge, or through the eye of the self. And all of these have a truth within their own station. So, are there any comments or further thoughts? Yeah, Kirk.
Or maybe he's mapping out humanity's collective evolution.
Which would be very interesting, because that would mean we're kind of evolving from like more Western to more Eastern modes of religiosity, if that's what it is.
Older, how can we be evolving that way? But
Yeah.
I'm really captured by two things that you said or pointed out. One is the opening to the Quran, and the second is Rumi's a piece about Moses. Those both sound like very limiting things.
Mm-hmm.
You must only walk a straight path. You must never fly because you have no wings. It sounds very negative. But what if you thought of it in terms of, if you did soar with wings, you'd miss so much. And if you only walked a straight path, you wouldn't see much. It's like being on the freeway on I-5. You're just zooming.
Yeah.
You don't see much of anything going on, which is why I like to get off the freeway so I can actually see something. The elder can tell you about, we had a discussion about that getting here. She wanted me to go on the freeway, and I said, no, let's go walk.
Yeah, that goes back to your earlier point, that there's a point to the stages of the journey. Yeah.
Right. And so the whole approach of the Seven Valleys is not to run a straight path, and it's not to fly over, but to take this kind of circuitous, challenging course, because you have to go through the scenery or the experience in order to really get somewhere.
Yeah, and if the point is the experience, then that's how we would expect it to happen. But at the same time, in other places, Baha'u'llah says it is possible to traverse all of these valleys in one breath. So I suppose there's different modes, and in one mode, one takes the scenic route, literally,
Life
and
makes one much more stronger, and perhaps. So I think the point that he's making is the hardship actually brings strength.
I guess I'd ask, possible for whom? Yes, for Baha'u'llah, for a manifestation, but can really anyone else get it in Nebraska?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, Delda.
It's like the uttermost knowledge that we can attain about the Creator will be given to us by the manifestations. And it's very important to recognize the one in your day. But we can be comforted by the fact that he's unknowable. And 10,000 prophets, each as great as Moses, stand
Thunderstruck.
They can't know the Creator.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And
Lovely. Your
I think-
Arabic is great.
Thanks, Ron. So, so I think next week is off, and so the following week will.
Next week is the 31st.
Okay, so we'll come back next week and then have a week off. Yeah. So Valley of Unity next week. See you then.